There is a rule that has governed missile warfare for 70 years. Once a warhead reaches the top of its arc, it falls, predictably, along a path a computer can trace in a fraction of a second. Every interception Israel has pulled off in this entire war, every headline about the Iron Dome, every arrow interceptor rising into the dark to meet an incoming threat, depends on that one rule holding true. This week, Iran tried to break it. Something crossed the night sky over the Middle East that Israeli air defense crews had only ever seen inside a training simulation. Not a warhead falling in a clean, calculable curve. A warhead flying, gliding, banking, dipping, changing direction at a speed that Iran claims approaches 15 times the speed of sound. A weapon engineered for one purpose, and one purpose only: to make the most advanced air defense network on Earth obsolete in the span of a single flight. Its name is the Fattah II. In Persian, Fattah means the conqueror. And this week, as a new wave of strikes swept across the region, that weapon returned to the fight, and the reaction from Israel's own defense establishment has been anything but routine. Tonight, I'm going to walk you through exactly what this missile is designed to do, why it frightens air defense engineers far more than the barrages Israel has already learned to swat down, why Iran can't simply flood the skies with it, and why Israel's response this week may signal a fundamental shift in how this entire war gets fought from here forward. But I'm also going to be honest with you about what we actually know versus what Iran merely claims, because on a story like this, the gap between those two things is where the truth lives. So stay with me all the way to the end, because the final 3 signals I'll give you are the ones that will tell you where this war is really heading. Let's get into it. For months now, Israeli air defense has run on rhythm. A siren, a tracked launch, a window, narrow but calculable, during which interceptors climb to meet an incoming missile along a path refined by decades of engineering and hard combat experience. It's an extraordinary system. It has saved countless lives, and it works because of a single quiet assumption, that the enemy is playing by the same laws of physics that you are. The Fattah II is built to violate that assumption. According to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which first unveiled it back in November of 2023, this is a second-generation hypersonic weapon. And the critical word there isn't hypersonic. Plenty of missiles briefly go hypersonic on the way down. The critical phrase is what Iran claims it carries: a hypersonic-glide vehicle. Let me explain why that distinction is the entire story. Picture a normal ballistic missile as a thrown stone. It's fast. It can be precise, but it is, above all, predictable. Once it reaches the peak of its arc, gravity takes over, and it falls toward its target along a path that a defense computer can map almost instantly. That predictability is the vulnerability every missile defense system on the planet was designed to exploit. Now picture a stone that, halfway through its fall, decides to change direction. That's the idea behind a glide vehicle. Iran says the Fattah II separates from its booster and then glides through the upper atmosphere, maneuvering, shifting altitude, approaching from angles a defense system can't anticipate, all while traveling at a claimed top speed of Mach 15. That's somewhere around 18,000 kilometers an hour. Iran states the missile can reach targets roughly 1,400 to 1,500 kilometers away, which places every corner of Israel and every American base scattered across the Gulf comfortably within its reach. Extreme speed married to genuine in-flight maneuverability. That combination is precisely what makes a hypersonic glide vehicle so difficult to counter, and not just for Israel, for anyone. The American Patriot system, the THAAD system, even Israel's own Arrow interceptors were all engineered around one foundational assumption: that a target's path can be predicted. Take that predictability away, and you haven't made the problem harder. You've changed the nature of the problem entirely. Now, this is the moment where I have to be straight with you, because a great deal of the coverage you'll see about this weapon won't be. Iran's numbers are Iran's numbers, and Western analysts are openly, deeply skeptical of them. Respected defense publications have pointed out that even the earlier Fattah I was never convincingly demonstrated to be operational. Some experts go further, arguing that the Fattah II may in fact be what's called a maneuverable reentry vehicle, a MARV, rather than a true long-range hypersonic glide vehicle in the same class as Russia's Avangard or China's DFZF. And that difference is not a technicality. A maneuverable re-entry vehicle can nudge and adjust its path during its final descent. A true hypersonic glide vehicle can sustain long-range maneuvering across a huge stretch of its flight. Iran is claiming the second, far more advanced capability. The independently verifiable evidence for that claim is still thin, and public data from flight tests is scarce. So I want you to hold two ideas in your head at the same time as we go forward. This is either a genuine strategic breakthrough for Iran, or it's a carefully staged piece of deterrence theater dressed up in impressive numbers. And the honest, uncomfortable answer, right now, is that it very likely sits somewhere between those two poles. That ambiguity is not a weakness in this story. As you're about to see, it may be the most powerful part of Iran's entire strategy. So let's set aside the exact Mach number for a moment and ask a more revealing question. Not, is Iran telling the truth, but how is Israel behaving? Because how a country behaves tells you what it actually fears, no matter what it says in public. And here is the tell. When a country genuinely fears a weapon, its engineers don't simply reassure the public. They quietly begin redesigning the shield. And that is exactly what appears to be underway inside Israel's defense industry. The logic driving that redesign is blunt and a little frightening. It goes like this. No single interceptor, no matter how advanced, can guarantee a clean, reliable kill against a target that maneuvers unpredictably at hypersonic speed. One interceptor, one shot, one predictable target, that model may simply be finished against this class of weapon. So the thinking is shifting toward what's sometimes called zone-based defense. The idea that you saturate a whole region of sky with multiple interceptors working in concert, rather than betting everything on a single precise interception. Sit with what that actually represents. That is a defense establishment quietly conceding, through its own actions, that the shield Israeli civilians have trusted throughout this entire war has a real, unresolved gap sitting right at its core. And independent defense analysis suggests that building a Western system genuinely capable of countering this class of weapon reliably could take years and cost tens of billions of dollars. That is not a vulnerability that gets patched by next week, and Iran knows it. But here's what the technical breakdowns almost always miss. Because underneath the talk of Mach numbers and interceptor geometry, this weapon isn't really aimed at buildings. It's aimed at a belief. The belief that some places are safe. Think about what a hardened command center actually is. It's not just concrete and steel. It's a promise made to the people who work inside it, that while missiles fall on the world outside, this room, engineered at enormous cost over years of design work, will hold. That promise is the psychological floor that an entire military stands on. It's what allows people to do their jobs under fire. A weapon that can maneuver its way past the very defenses that a fortification was designed to work alongside doesn't just threaten a structure, it cracks that floor. And once that floor is cracked, something changes that no interceptor can ever repair. Every officer in every other hardened facility across the country begins carrying a quiet, unspoken question into every single shift. Is this place still what they promised me it was? That doubt is a weapon in its own right, and here's the cruelest part for Israel. It costs Iran almost nothing to keep that doubt loaded. Iran doesn't need to fire this missile constantly. It just needs everyone to know that it exists, and that it might. Which brings us to Israel's response this week, and why it genuinely caught so many seasoned observers off guard. There was no hedging. None of the careful, conditional, leave room for negotiation language that governments reach for when they want to preserve their options. Instead, Israel's posture hardened into something that sounded much closer to a pre-written commitment. If Iran strikes Israeli territory directly, the response will be immediate and unconditional. No dependencies, no waiting, no conditions attached. Now I want you to listen carefully to what that language is not. It is not the language of a government keeping its options open. It is the language of a military that has already decided, in advance, precisely what it will do the moment this weapon crosses back into its airspace. And that certainty is itself the clue. Think about it. You do not pre-commit to overwhelming, automatic retaliation over a threat you are quietly confident you can simply shoot down. You reach for that kind of language over a threat you are not sure you can stop. That is the strategic shift hiding in plain sight. When you can no longer guarantee the shield, you start leaning on the sword. Deterrence stops being about interception and starts being about punishment, about making the cost of a successful strike so unbearable that your enemy never attempts it in the first place. The blunt, unhedged tone from Israel this week is what that shift sounds like out loud. So does all of this mean Iran now holds the upper hand? That it can overwhelm Israel's defenses whenever it chooses? Almost certainly not. And here is the constraint that reframes this entire story. You cannot win a war with a weapon you can barely manufacture. Hypersonic-glide technology demands extraordinarily precise materials, sophisticated guidance software, and manufacturing tolerances that even wealthy, unsanctioned nations struggle to perfect. And Iran has spent nearly half a century under some of the most comprehensive sanctions ever imposed on a single country. Assessments of its missile program point to real production bottlenecks, the kind of constraints that, earlier in this war, reportedly forced Iran to lean more heavily on its older, more vulnerable liquid fuel missiles than its own war plans had originally intended. What that tells us is critical. The Fattah II is almost certainly a scarce, high-value asset, not a weapon Iran can rain down in the kind of saturating, overwhelming barrages that would actually be required to defeat a multi-layered defense network across a sustained campaign. And that scarcity dictates the strategy completely. When you only have a handful of a precious weapon, you don't spend it on volume, you spend it on symbolism. You use it against a small number of maximally significant targets, extracting the greatest possible psychological and strategic shock from each individual shot. So this is the real Fattah II, stripped of both the hype and the dismissiveness. It is not a war-ending superweapon that renders Israel defenseless, but it is not empty propaganda either. It's a rare, genuinely alarming capability that Iran is forced to wield like a scalpel, precisely because it doesn't possess nearly enough of them to swing like a hammer. That tension, a weapon technologically capable of reshaping the strategic map but shackled by the harsh realities of wartime production under sanctions and bombardment, is exactly the nuance that gets flattened in the loudest headlines. And it's the nuance you need in order to understand what happens next. Because the ripples from this weapon travel far, far beyond the space between Israel and Iran. Start with the United States. American missile defense, THAAD, Patriot, the Aegis system at sea, faces the exact same fundamental physics problem that a hypersonic glide vehicle poses to anyone. It doesn't matter how advanced your interceptors are if the target refuses to travel a predictable path. The US has been investing for years in its own answer to this, a dedicated interceptor built specifically to catch weapons during their glide phase, but that system isn't expected to be ready until late this decade. Which means that if Iran's capability is even partially real, this technological frontier has begun leaking out of the exclusive club of the world's great powers and into a regional arsenal. That alone forces a rethink of American force posture anywhere Iran's missiles could conceivably reach. Then consider Iran's regional partners, the states and armed groups that have historically relied on Iranian missile technology. Battlefield evidence, even contested battlefield evidence, is a powerful advertisement. It reshapes who wants that technology next and what they're willing to trade for it, long after this particular conflict ends. And then consider the Gulf states, already living at the hard end of this reality. Iranian missile fire has been striking across the region this week, and even where the Fattah II specifically wasn't involved, the pattern is the same. Nation after nation forced to pour money into ever more expensive air defense upgrades, simply to keep pace with a regional missile threat that keeps advancing even as the broader war grinds on with no clear resolution in sight. This is how a single weapon system ripples outward across an entire strategic map, not because it will be used everywhere, but because everyone now has to plan as though it might be. So let me pull all of this together, because the true significance of what happened this week only comes into focus when you hold every piece at once. Iran did not simply build a faster missile. It attempted to build a weapon aimed directly at the physics underneath modern missile defense itself. And whether or not the Fattah II fully lives up to Tehran's dramatic claims, it has already achieved something concrete and measurable. It has forced Israel's defense establishment into a blunt, unconditional deterrence posture that it did not hold in the earlier phases of this war. That behavioral shift tells you more about how seriously Israel privately takes this threat than any single interception statistic ever could. A regional power that most Western defense planners had confidently assumed was lagging years behind the genuine hypersonic powers has now, at minimum, forced the world to take its claims seriously. Seriously enough that Israel's own engineers appear to be quietly redrawing the blueprint of national defense, and Israel's own officials have abandoned the careful language of negotiation for the flat, hard language of automatic retaliation. That is the real headline. Not that a missile flew, but that the response to it revealed just how much the ground beneath this war may have shifted. So where does it go from here? I want to leave you with 3 specific signals to watch, because these are the things that will separate reality from rhetoric in the weeks ahead. Ignore the noise and watch for these. The first signal: does Iran fire multiple Fattah 2s in a single coordinated barrage? So far, everything points to isolated, high-value symbolic strikes. If that ever changes, if Iran demonstrates it can launch several of these at once, that would signal a dramatic and genuinely alarming leap in its production capacity. That's the moment the scalpel starts becoming a hammer, and everything I've told you about scarcity would need to be rewritten. The second signal: do Israel's defense contractors actually begin fielding that new zone-based multi-interceptor architecture? Talk is cheap, but a genuine, expensive redesign of core defense doctrine is not something a country undertakes over a bluff. If that redesign becomes real, it confirms just how seriously Israel privately assesses this vulnerability, regardless of what anyone says on camera. And the third signal, the one that matters most: does Iran choose to strike Israeli territory directly with this weapon again, deliberately testing that promise of immediate, unconditional retaliation? Because that single decision would reveal Tehran's true risk tolerance at this stage of the war more honestly than any public statement from either side ever could. It would tell us whether Iran believes its own deterrent, or whether it's afraid of Israel's. The rule that has governed this kind of warfare for 70 years has now been challenged. Whether it truly broke or merely bent is precisely what these next few weeks are going to decide. If you want to understand where this goes next and cut through the spin coming at you from every direction, then make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and drop a comment below. The more people who genuinely understand what's moving across that sky, the harder it becomes for anyone to distort it. We'll be watching this one minute by minute, and the moment it shifts, you'll hear it here first. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.